We still have another 20 days left in these woods, and I just hope we can make it to the end before something truly bad happens. I feel like I'm beginning to lose my mind. It's only been 5 days since the last log, but so much has happened. I feel like I need to record the events. I had lost contact with Tower 7, with Peter, 2 nights ago. His last few messages to myself and Katie were strange. He told us that he was hearing voices coming from outside of his tower. Whispers, beckoning him to come outside. He said that no matter where he was inside the tower, the voices would always sound like they were right next to him. He said he took everything that wasn't bolted down and stacked it in front of the large shattered window and door. He attempted to contact anyone on the emergency frequency, though received no reply. When he told us this, we each tried to do the same, and it was in that moment that we realized all 3 of us were alone out here. The evening before Peter's radio went silent, he was saying that he could hear heavy footsteps ascending the tower. They'd rattle off the metal steps and get right up to the tower's platform before stopping. He said when he looked out of the window, he couldn't see anyone standing there. He asked us what he should do, and honestly, we didn't have an answer for him. We could hear his increasing distress through the crackling receiver, but we were at a loss. His radio went silent shortly after that. Both Katie and I tried contacting him over and over again, but every time, no response was heard from Tower 7. I had considered packing up a bag and hiking through the forest to his tower. However, every time I stepped outside and looked down at the trees below, I'd turn around and go back inside. I felt terrible every time I tried to attempt it and failed. If this had happened on the first day, I would already be on my way over to his tower. But after experiencing what I had been for the past 2 weeks, my brain couldn't push my body down those steps. Yesterday morning, I spent hours just standing on the small ledge outside my tower door, using my binoculars to look over at Tower 7. Even though it had always been fairly difficult to spot from my position, looking at the structure now, it just seemed lifeless, like looking at an abandoned building. I spent the afternoon speaking with Katie in Tower 9. She had been growing more and more concerned with each passing hour. She had been oblivious to the things both Peter and I had witnessed. She couldn't understand what was happening. Hell, I barely understood it myself. She kept asking me for advice on what we should do about Tower 7, and much like with Peter, I didn't really have an answer. The best I could muster was to tell her to remain in her tower, and that we'll keep trying to contact Tower 7. Even though I could hear defeat in her voice, she agreed. Hours passed and the sun began to fall from the sky. With night growing on the horizon, a chill swept through the area. It was far colder this night than any other night previously. I began to stack whatever I could in front of the door to my tower. I wasn't entirely sure what I'd be preparing for, or if something like this would work, but doing this provided a bit of relief to my nerves. As I sat there huddled in the corner with a small lamp at my side and my gun within reach, I stared off through the window, trying to remain alert. At roughly midnight, something happened. I felt my head beginning to nod as I was struggling to keep my eyes open, when the radio crackled for a second. I felt my eyes shoot open, not entirely sure if I truly heard something. The crackling returned a second time and I walked over to it. I picked up the receiver and asked if it was Peter. A long 5 minutes passed. The silence in the air was so heavy that the ticks from my watch sounded like a hammer on metal. A voice spoke through the radio, and when I heard it, I dropped the receiver and backed away. The voice was faint and distant, and yet at the same time, it felt like the voice was right behind me, speaking into my ear. It said, "I can see you." I backed up across the length of the tower until my back pressed up against the cold glass of the window. I felt my breathing become shallow. I had never heard a voice like that before, and it clearly wasn't Peter. I turned and looked in the direction of Tower 7, though it was impossible to see it in the dark. I was at a loss for words and actions. I slid down to the floor and sat there looking at the now silent radio. I stayed like this for nearly an hour. I thought about walking over and attempting to contact Katie, but I couldn't force myself to move from the spot. The minutes were ticking by and I was longing for sunrise to crest over the trees. That's when I heard a sound coming from outside the tower. The sound of heavy footfalls on each step leading up to the top. I could feel my pulse beginning to quicken, and the thrum of my heartbeat began to sync up with each deliberate step. The steps seemed to reverberate endlessly. Then, when they grew the loudest at the top of the stairs, they stopped. I stood up and looked through the window across the tower. There was nothing there. A million things were racing through my mind, wondering who or what could have been making that noise. I waited, and no more footsteps came. It would have been foolish for me to think this was a product of my imagination at this point. I could clearly hear those footsteps drawing closer and closer. There was definitely something outside of my tower. As I stood in silence, trying to mentally prepare myself for something to happen, I heard a new sound. A sharp tick, tick, tick against one of the glass windows. I slowly turned. There was something hanging upside down from on top of the tower. Its head seemed to be floating in midair. Long, stringy black hair dangled from its scalp like a torn-up bedsheet. Its eyes were heavily sunken into its face, and they didn't seem to have any pupils. A twisted grin stretched from ear to ear. Teeth, like sharp, jagged rocks, infested its mouth. Long, bony fingers held this thing in place against the glass. Fingers that were nearly as long as my forearm. It curled a single finger, rapping the nail against the glass over and over again. Despite my fear upon seeing this thing, I did notice that this creature didn't look like the one that had previously carried the lantern. Well, not entirely the same, that is. This one looked vicious, like it wanted to harm me, while the other one just seemed curious, if that makes any sense. It stared at me like a beast, stalking its prey. I could feel my throat begin to dry up and sweat begin to drop from my forehead. I eyed the shotgun resting on the ground near where I was previously sitting. Its teeth began to separate, revealing a slimy black tongue that licked across the glass. Strings of foul saliva dripped against it, nearly causing me to gag. It began tapping harder and harder on the glass. A moment later, my worst fear came to life. The window began to crack. It started where the finger was impacting, then began to branch out like a spiderweb until the entire pane was a brittle mess. One final tap, and the entire window shattered. When that happened, I felt my body jerk forward and I dove for the gun. I scooped it up with both hands and fired directly at the window. The sound left a harsh ringing in my ears that didn't subside for some time, and wafts of smoke filled the tower. A moment later, the smoke cleared, and I looked at the window. There was no sign of it anywhere. I had no idea if I had hit it or not. There didn't seem to be any indication left behind. My hands were trembling so badly as I held the gun, that the rattling of metal and wood was quickly overtaking the incessant ringing. I stood up and slowly walked over to the window. I looked around for a few moments, and once I was convinced it had gone, I looked over the ledge. When I did, I saw something large and dark disappearing into the trees, heading away from the tower. The sun eventually began to rise, and I could feel warmth returning to me after such a cold, terrible night. I contacted Katie and told her what had happened. She was in complete disbelief, and honestly, I don't blame her. I'm not sure what to do at this point. I doubt we're going to make it to the end of all this. I don't know how many more shells that thing can take, but my ammo will run out eventually, and then it will be too late. I can't stop thinking about Katie and how she could be next. It's an insane thought, I know, but I feel like I need to go to her, to help her. I don't know if I will write again, or if I'll even be here to write again. I'm going to take a day to gather my thoughts, and then I'm going to leave the tower to find Katie. If I don't write again, then it means I failed. And for that, I am sorry. "3 days have passed since my last entry. My bloodied hands are trembling as I write this. This experience is leaving a heavy scar on my mind, figuratively and literally. I suppose I should record what has happened as best I can, though the more I try to recall the events, the more my brain attempts to block them out. After the sun rose the day after that thing tried to break into my tower, I lost consciousness. The fatigue of being awake all night, coupled with the shocking events, were too much for my body to handle. Once the adrenaline subsided, I could barely keep my eyes open. I awoke sometime later in the afternoon to the sound of Katie calling me on the radio. She sounded panicked, frightened. When I answered, she practically shouted with joy. She said that after I didn't check in that morning, she had gotten worried that something might have happened to me. I told her something did happen, but that I was okay now. I spent nearly a half hour explaining the previous night in as much detail as I could recall. She just remained silent on the other end. Once I finished, she only asked me a single question. What do we do now? For the first time in hours, I was finally able to think clearly. I told her that we needed to work together in order to make it out of here. She agreed, and I asked her if she could handle being alone one more night. She told me that she hadn't seen anything unusual so far, and that she should be alright. I made sure to explain that she needed to barricade her tower as best she could, and keep her gun on her at all times. I then told her that at dawn, I would begin hiking her way. After I got off the radio, I stared at the massive hole where the window once stood. It made me think about Peter, and I wondered if this was what his tower looked like as well. The sun was already descending, and I spent the early part of that night packing up my backpack with all the essentials I could. I made sure my shotgun was loaded, and I leaned against the wall opposite the broken window. I wasn't sure if that thing would come back after getting shot at, but regardless, I'd be ready if that was the case. Midnight rolled around, and due to my now irregular sleeping pattern, I was still fairly alert. I kept my ears open for any odd sounds coming from outside the tower, but aside from the occasional cricket and frog, there was nothing. Then, the radio emitted a high-pitched whine before Katie's voice came through. She sounded terrified and told me that something was outside her tower. Upon hearing this, I felt that rush of adrenaline course back into me, and I realized that I had a choice to make. I couldn't just sit idly by like I had done with Peter. I told her that I was on my way, and to just hold on a little while longer. I truly didn't want to be traveling through the woods at night, but if it meant potentially helping Katie, I had to try. Hearing her frightened voice continually looped in the back of my mind. I grabbed my bag, gun, and personal radio, then headed for the door. For the first time in days, I stepped outside of my tower. I moved quickly down the steps and took note of the direction I needed to head in to make it to Tower 9. I walked briskly, taking care not to sprint, because I knew if I had gotten a leg injury, then we both would be in big trouble. I moved as fast and as carefully as I could manage. Walking through the woods was disorienting. Every tree looked nearly identical to each other. I used my flashlight and compass to maintain my heading as best I could. I figured if I could at least make it to the lake, that I'd be able to spot her tower nearby. My senses during the journey felt razor sharp, as every sound and movement drew my attention. I had made no note of the time when I left, nor during my trek, but it felt like I had been walking for hours. Traversing the uneven terrain was beginning to take its toll on my legs and feet. I stopped briefly to rest against a tree, when the sound of a loud yet distant gunshot echoed around me. That adrenaline I had felt the previous night, and when I heard Katie calling for help course through me yet again. I pushed off the tree and picked up the pace. By this point, I was throwing caution to the wind. I was hurtling over boulders and through dense brush. I was practically sprinting through the woods, and after 10 more minutes, I emerged from the tree line. I was greeted by the soothing sounds of waves lapping against a muddy shore. I had made it to the lake. After taking a moment to look at the moon's reflection in the water, I turned and saw the light from Tower 9. It wasn't too far away from my current location. As I skirted my way along the lake, I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing tower ahead. I was drawing closer and closer when I thought I heard something in the trees to my left. I froze in place and turned, my weapon leveled in that direction. It was far too dark to make out anything in the trees. I just held my breath and tried my best to focus on any sort of movement. 5 minutes passed without a single sound. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. I felt my body relax slightly. I turned and continued walking towards the tower. Once I arrived at the base of the stairs, I looked up at the tower, and a strange yet familiar feeling came over me. It was a feeling I had previously when I looked at Peter's tower. Like this tower was now abandoned. Dread was beginning to fill me, and I rushed up the stairs as quickly as I could. When I got to the door, I stopped. Inside looked like a tornado hit it. Books and papers were strewn about. Tables and desks were toppled over. I saw no sign of anyone. I slammed my fist against the wall and cursed myself for being too slow. Just when I was about to turn and head back downstairs, I heard something. It was a voice. A whisper calling out to me. I turned back, and on the other side of an overturned desk, huddled in the corner, was a young woman with dark hair. She was clutching a gun in her hands and was trembling terribly. I held my hands up and told her who I was. Her face seemed to light up as she recognized my voice. Then, that light on her face vanished in a flash, as she shouted at me to look out. Confused, I turned, and was face to face with a large, jagged grin. Its vacant white eyes were inches away from mine. I felt my entire body lock up, and before I knew it, I was thrown to the ground. It happened so fast I didn't know what had caused it. I felt my legs start being pulled out of the doorway, and I tried to scramble for my gun. It was no use. I was already being dragged forcefully outside. The creature was gripping my leg with such force that I could feel my shin starting to crack. It jerked me around one of the corners of the stairs, slamming me into the railing. My head impacted with the wood, and I could feel blood dripping down into my eyes. I tried screaming for help, but every step I hit while being dragged took the air out of my lungs. We were halfway down the tower steps when a gunshot sounded. The creature that was holding me reared back and unleashed a deafening screech. As it did that, it threw its arms to the side. I was still in its grasp, so I went tumbling over the railing and fell from the tower. That was the last thing I remember. I woke up a day and a half later to Katie speaking nearby. I sat up and immediately I could feel pain shooting through my leg and head. Katie saw that I was awake and came over to ask me how I was feeling. I could barely speak, and she told me that everything will be alright. I asked her what had happened, and she said that after she shot at the creature, and it dropped me, it took off down the stairs into the woods. She carried me back up into the tower and bandaged me up as best she could with her tower's first aid kit. I was surprised that such a slender woman was able to lift me back up multiple flights of stairs. I guess you really can't judge a book by its cover. She said she had been trying to call for help every hour, on any frequency, but haven't been able to reach anybody. I thanked her for saving my life, and she thanked me for trying to save hers. I asked her about that night, and she said that she had heard something climbing up her tower when she called me, but didn't see anything. And when I asked her about the gunshot, she pointed to the roof. She said she remembered what I had told her about the creature climbing onto the roof of my tower. I looked up and saw multiple holes letting in faint sunlight in the roof. She said she never actually saw the creature. She just panicked and fired. It wasn't until I showed up that she saw it for the first time. She made us some food, and I spent that evening trying my best to recover. Despite my poor health, I convinced her that we needed to take shifts to keep an eye on things until we could get in contact with somebody. Katie's sleeping right now, and to pass the time, I wanted to write this out. However, it's proving difficult with my shaking hands. I don't know what's going to happen next. We still have 12 more days until we are scheduled to go home. With my messed up leg, I doubt we'll be making a run for it. I'm just glad I'm not alone anymore. I know between the two of us, we can hold out until then. We can make it out. I hope we can make it out. This will be the final log of Lookout Tower 8. After all the things I've